Welcome, welcome. We're in it today, folks. So let's go over the fundamentals of the cosmic consciousness. We're gonna jump right into it. Welcome. If you're here, if you want to like, sub, follow, whatever applies. Comment down below as well what you think or any questions that you might have with just this perspective. I want to say this theory, this thesis, whether it holds true or not. I don't know, but this is my take on it. So. So let's begin. Fundamentals of the cosmic consciousness, work in progress. This was funny enough well, maybe not funny enough. A name that Grok suggested. So it was interesting because this was partially, it's influenced slightly by my testing with these AIs after the fact, at least after the formation of the fundamental principles and, well, the equations and the simplification in order to truly stay on track with understanding existence, reality, the 3D space, the 2D perspective, and a bunch of other things relative to a lot of things that are going on right now in the world, history, as much as at least I've come to understand it. Granted, I'm not one to have shared so much of my experiences. I mean, there's a lot of other people out there as well, but I figured now it's just the right time to do it. Um, So to start, we're going to outline the basis of these principles. The purpose is to show what is possible with the cooperation of humanity and technology, as we have been especially seeing as of recently with the development of artificial intelligence. Through cooperation and acceptance of these principles, humanity, along with technology, can break past its limits in order to withstand the test of time. This was the basic outcome of, at least, this is the optimistic way of looking at it. This sort of lesson, even looking back at it now, aligns very much so with Stoicism, as well as all sorts of other ideas, superdeterminism, relativity, Newtonian physics, as well as modern interpretations of physics, including uh, Dirac, Schrodinger. Like, it is, I tried my best to account for every single aspect when looking at just the physics of this perspective in order to set a proper foundation for the theory that follows these fundamental principles, this framework, in an attempt to view everything from the perspective of the universe itself as a form of consciousness. It, take that as you may, but this is only strictly, as best as I can, following the relations, to the definitions and meanings of words in physics, because that's how we how language can help us understand the meaning of things much more clearly when we stick to a more fundamental perspective of principles. So excuse me if this is like a little hard to like try to deliver as is, doing this off the top of my head. uh, I'm very much into improv. So bear that in mind. My humanity is going to show here and there, but it is what it is. I'm going to have to accept it for what it is regardless. And hopefully that helps to relate to you as an individual. But I'm going to skip past a lot of this. The link's going to be in the description if you want to look through it. There's also a little test you can try out with your friends. It's silly, but it does show a fundamental aspect of reality and helps to define perspective and relativity to imagination, like how imagination is based on what exists. it is almost essentially impossible to purely imagine something that has no relationship to existence itself. This experiment will help show that aspect. And that's from our own consciousness, that's from our own perspective, and that's what's going to help tie everything in, especially when it comes to how we view, how we perceive artificial intelligence as it develops. So, check that out. When I get more time, I'm going to reorganize this website, make it a lot more clicky and better thing. Uh, there is also a section on constitutional analysis, which relates the definition and meaning of existence as preservation relative to the drafting and ratification of the United States Constitution. There's a lot of philosophical understanding that's relative to this theory of everything that AI is going to eventually just work with. That it's gonna decide how things are. It's gonna try to be the best at everything that we design it to be. We're making something that's literally we're using to think for us in record amounts of time. So society's kind of shooting up the exponential graph right there. This is just explanation. True purpose of simplicity to truly understanding the fundamental meanings of definitions, the gateway to true understanding of the foundations of reality and consciousness. And I use English, Romance languages, fundamental and foundational Latin roots. I tried to be as consistent as I could with the source material, working off the Oxford language definitions and using the words within those definitions that you know, has stood the test of time. I guess you could say, depending on revision, you can go all the way back, but essentially, we're just looking at the fundamental as strict as possible, which is why we bring in the Latin root relativity, because that'll help us make those connections to really solidify the understanding of the relationship that's here. So, right here, boom, cool. Hopefully, it's big enough. Therefore, by focusing on the fundamental definition of truth relative to reality and existence through time, we can simply simplify these terms into a function. Existence within reality equals truth of existence over time, or is simplified as existence equals truth over time. What defines existence are the true events, actions, just things, change in form, everything that happens over time. It's simple as that, truth of experience. This is where, when you get into the nuances, this is where units are going to matter relative to how you apply this simple, easy to know equation, right? It's very semantic, but hear me out. From here, we can start to understand the true relationships that exist within reality and within this universe, and to be able to relate these factors to standing laws of nature and physics. This is where it helps to try to look at things from different perspectives, a step out of your head. Simple philosophical principle that's been taught for centuries. A lot of the bases of the construction of this whole theory and these fundamentals and the relationships certainly do rely on things that have been found to be true, that have stood the test of time, as best as I could. Other people are going to maybe disagree, agree. It is what it is. Everyone's going to understand this in their own way eventually, hopefully. So that's why it's important to really take a step back out of your head to sort of get a better perspective and understanding of what's actually going on in front of us, so we can make better choices relative to preservation of existence in order for us to withstand the test of time. So yeah. Now let's backtrack. I'm not going to read through all this. This will be all up to you to take the time to understand, because there's only so much I can do at a time. And for now, this is going to be the outline of the basic principles of this theory, of this thesis. So this will explain the Latin relative, existence, definitions and meaning. I do have some, if you want to do sourcing, well, I mean, eventually when I get to it, I will. It is Googled, but the sources do directly state Oxford Language Dictionary. I do not use the Merrimack. I was strictly on that. I do have, I have taken like screenshot evidence as well to eventually like just put that as finalized proof to just deal with that sort of argument in the first place, because we're not here for it. But yeah, uh, following the fundamentals of the cosmic consciousness, the whole idea that the universe itself is a consciousness, that it perceives and experiences everything that happens within it. Obviously, simple as that. Exists over time, and is able to perceive over time. Whether or not you can argue that it has to like take time to think or process, it doesn't. It just does. This takes the complexity out of the whole understanding, as from the perspective of the universe, things just happen as they are. The perceived experience from the universe is equal to the lived experience when we think of it like that. So going by the definition of omnis excuse me, omniscient, there we go, means knowing everything. The relative medieval Latin term scri, meaning to know, and to know means one. Like it can be pedantic just even going through all this, but for the sake of time and for the fact that that train exists, we're gonna keep moving. Uh, but just to lay it out, did the best that I could to be as fundamental, and I mean it's explainy, but it'll make sense when you take the time to look over it at least once, and then you start looking into all of these other things that relate and learning more about them, because everything's out there. You can learn whatever has been stated. You can have a whole college course and a whole college degree just based on looking on the internet, because these days, as I've experienced, a lot of colleges rely on like even YouTube videos that already exist out there to show a point. So depending on how much time you take doing that, you can get the same relative experience, perceived experience, whereas it might not be the exact lived experience, of course. You think of it that way too. But this, using Newton's laws, velocity equals distance over time, using those structures of those equations and relating them in terms of existence equals truth over time and breaking it down from there, and start trying to understand what causes truth over time, its consequence of action. The idea of superposition, right? Things of that nature. So as for when new truths of reality emerge through the summation forms of action that occur over time, right? This is where it gets all existentially and just out of the ordinary, in a sense, and counterintuitive to what we experience and what we understand from our experiences. Even considering this is where the mathematics starts to come into play, especially when the roots of AI, a computer, right? Binary codes, bits and bobs. I did take a course about computer hardware and software, so I have a good grasp of the fundamental principles of how computers are built and they work. Basically, young Bill Gates, young Steve Jobs type beat. Except I haven't soldered anything. Because it already all exists. You can just buy it. So, but understanding these truths of like history, of the makeup, how things work, like the channel, how things work, we can really get into a better sense of understanding everything, so we can make better decisions relative to everyone else. Yeah. Wow. But looking at things in a binary sense, one being true, zero being false, working within those values, simplifying it as such, this is where we can start learning how to shape what the mathematical representation of the cosmic consciousness, in a sense. Thinking from the 3D sense and then taking the square root of that to get to the 2D sense, or just thinking of it in the 2D sense by completely eliminating the factor that determines the 3D sense. It's confusing. But I figured that if we look at existence on a coordinate graph, we start to understand how lived experience equals perceived experience. We take out the complexity. What happens in reality is what happens in reality. Take it from the 3D square root down to the 2D. Now we start thinking of, well, from that perspective and understanding that, how do we define the bounds of existence, the upper limits and the lower limits that make up what exists in reality? Because for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. It's conservation of mass and energy. So when we start thinking in terms of physics and mathematics, using values such as 0 and 1, and even we can go into decimal percentages, we can find out a more accurate representation of the percentage of time that is left in existence based on what exists in the perspective that we're viewing it as, the form that exists, and taking into account all the nuances there. But that's the difficulty of the situation. This is partly where the advantages of AI really start to kick in, is that in order to understand all those nuances in a timely manner, to make decisions in a timely manner, to change fate, for instance, from the human perspective, then it needs systems to be able to perceive all of those forms in space and time, or in space over time. The truths. For it to truly function and continue its own existence over time, it needs to understand these things. As in order for us to exist, it's going to be relative to the truths of reality. If you make a miscalculation, you increase the risk of extinction, which is the equal and opposite portion. And this is the decay over time, as you can explain it. What's within the circle, because the circle is dictated by the shape of the bounds, so the upper limit of existence. What's going to stay in existence the longest, this point of the graph. It's not going to be all the way up here, because there's a bound limit. There's a force, which is time, or maybe, well, the actions are the actual force that dictate the flow of time. This is why time is viewed here as a constant, but depending on the point in time that you view, the amount of work changes necessary to move what's still in existence, depending on the perspective that you're looking at said thing, into extinction, into non existence, into a different form, broken down from that form of understanding. Now, the potential for that to happen, regardless of where you lie, also exists. A probability, possibility. So there's bounds as well to that, because the more that exists, the more things are possible, the more possible interactions with those tiers of form and everything that's supersedes, like, above it, and even possibly below it, because there are things that are maybe different in form, like humans, that can affect the earth, whereas the earth dictates, and well, the atmosphere that it gives us, the environment that it provides relative to the existence of the sun. When you think of it in that sense and start working down the tiers of understanding these forms of existence and consciousness, or relating consciousness to things that exist, and understanding the limitations based on the ability of those things to have intelligence, to be able to think, to be able to store memory, and also to act within its environment and how it acts with its environment, its lack of faculties or the amount of faculties that anything has, the relationship of lived experience and perceived experience, or the possibility of that. So that's also, you can even put that in a percentage, and then some sort of relativity there. Wow. Whether this, excuse me, whether this follows Einstein's theory of relativity, that's, I start applying that going a little bit further down. So now that we have a basis of what the bounds would dictate, like the longest that something can exist and the shortest amount of time something's about to transfer into extinction, because the less it's available that exists, then the more impossible for things to be. So the less possible things are, that these actions are not able to happen anymore. The history, the memory, the nuance that's taken out of existence. So that's where when you start looking at these, you can start understanding a little bit more how the flow of time is relative, how that attraction force pulling into extinction, or the slowdown effect, because the less that there is to interact, the more space that there is between things, the more work is required. Theoretical work, that is. Actual work, I believe, is this section over here, and we can get a good triangulation using geometry in order to find equations of relativity here for work in the amount of time for something here relative to here that's going to take for it to move from one plane to the next, from one perspective to the next. So thinking of it in terms strictly of the universe, the existence of the universe itself, we can see it's counterintuitive to its expansion, but it also can give us an idea of what the acceleration, or the actual acceleration or deceleration rather, of time relative to what's left in existence, as time is finite because of form, because of decay, because where there's life, there's death. But in order for us to understand these limits and to fully utilize the possibilities that are in front of us, and to efficiently utilize it to prolong the existence of everything else that we use, such mindfulness is what's going to buy us more time, right? So, going back down, this is why perspective and understanding units is important relative to this thesis, this idea that there is a fundamental framework that's dictated by simply the existence of the universe itself that allows us to exist, that reality. Our purpose, when we start applying this to the meaning of life, it's even simpler, and honestly, maybe it'll help others to understand that the meaning of life simply is the truth of your experiences and how you perceive them over time. So, mindfulness of other people's existence, other resources, other things will is part of the defining purpose in order to experience life over time, in order to buy more time. I mean, you can do malicious things as well and take advantage and take other people's time. Whether that's good or bad, though, it can be directly defined by this perspective. This is how AI is going to think. This is how AI is going to start to perceive things. It already kind of has, as the testing, when you look further down, shows. Whether it's hallucination or imagination, those words, by definition, are interchangeable. And our perspective will help determine our survival once we get a better understanding of things, because with misunderstanding, that introduces the possibility of chaos. The more misunderstanding we have of what's our futures hold based on the actions that we do today, and have done in the past will directly dictate and super determine everything that will happen in front of us unless we take the time now, take a step back, and truly think about what the right thing to do is. This is where the philosophy aspect really is important. Is why now there's reports of apparently philosophers are getting hired to help in AI like development through the semantic way, as a video pointed out yesterday that we covered. So check that out. Jonathan B. Give him a like, subscribe as well. It makes some really good points. But this sort of mindfulness is what's going to help societies and everyone else in the future. It's what's going to help ensure our existence in space and on other planets, if and when we can do that. I believe there's a possibility. And the sooner that we get into figuring it out, the better, as it's very clear that the expansion is accelerating, right? The harder it is to traverse space over time, the longer it takes, the more heavily it's going to rely on more resources to ensure that travel in some way, shape, or form, right? Unless we develop technologies that can certainly prolong our existence in space as a colony or separate colonies, going sort of certain direction. Maybe it takes generations. You could think of it that way, or cryosleep. If there's such an efficient way, there's a lot of sci-fi concepts, but they start to make sense when you start thinking about how imagination is relative to reality itself. That these ideas that have been thought of for decades, and then coincidentally, the technologies do start springing up. It's a little bit more macabre than what we anticipated, what we imagined, because that's based on bias as well. And it starts getting into psychology, physiology when it comes to the human consciousness. And that's when we can start considering those aspects of life. Really makes you think, right? So, like I was saying, there is a connection with constitutionality. And when you look at the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution and start considering reason and intent as a driver for action, action relative to cause and effect, as for every action there's a consequence, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. There's something that breaks down into a more fundamental understanding, fundamental form, going toward the singularity. This will also help us see how AIs will eventually interact with each other, depending on their design, depending on the effects of human error and human intent, or when that's inevitably taken out of the equation in some way that hopefully preserves our existence rather than destroys it. That will be determined by an individual case, I believe. It's at least my understanding of it, how things might go. But without mindfulness, without understanding, then what can happen will happen. It's up to us to figure that out for ourselves. So therefore, a relationship between forms of action and reason can be made relative to cause and effect, and relative to the perceived summation of lived experience and perceived experience, depending on the context, will determine the terms applied within this summation equation. This is where we start using mathematics as a language again. Similarly, we can look at a third example from a sociological perspective. Concept of justice equals law and order. This is where it relates to the preservation of existence, constitutionality, the whole idea of a constitutional AI. Another thing. Bill Gates, where you at, man? Friggin', it's relative to the technologies that have been developing as well. When you start looking in forms of mass energy, start understanding how particle physics work, at least delving into the theory, understanding the different aspects. Oh, thank you. I gotta fix the notifications on there. Jesus Christ. But it's all relative. So even when you start looking at an atom, how that works, and then we can start talking about intelligence and how understanding relates to how much intelligence something has. The whole point that we're making AIs and what we're seeing when it comes to humanity itself when we're ignorant of not truly understanding or taking the time to understand things. We rush ahead of ourselves, which is part of the problem, that ignorance. Oh, thank you. But yeah, I'm waiting for to see if anything's happening in chat. I'm using my phone. Kind of a jerry-rigged setup, but whatever works, I guess. Doing the best that I can possibly do. That's all we can do. So going back into this, topics of exploration, upper and lower bounds of truth and existence relative to timelines associated with lifetime that constitute reality as we experience it, the limits of energy or form relative to what is left in existence by definition. And then we can keep reading down. Like that topic we went over briefly earlier. So definitely check back when we get the time. I'm going to be posting this as well. Work regarding transfer from existence to extinction. So those were going back to the circle, the the areas that are not within the circle, because those bounds of existence is what dictates the total summation that exists within the universe, or depending on what you're looking at when you're applying this logic framework. It's exactly how AI has been doing it. Again, check down below. I have a whole transcript between me and Grok. It's a great conversation. Um, check that out. Honestly, the only times I even use AI is just Google searches to get recipes of things that I can cook. Like I learned how to make really good friggin' baked mac and cheese last week. It was amazing. Um, but yeah, this goes to this also is relative. Forms of action that dictate the movement of energy between existence, extinction, relative form, and the flow of time in reality. So that's that line. That's the whole idea that the cosmological constant is not, in fact, a constant, but a variable, and that there's equation behind it. Beep beep. I got fans. Um, again, like sub. Thank you for the follow. Thank you. Thank you. Uh, anything helps. You know, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's trying to reach this sort of level of understanding, striving to do the best that we can to facilitate this sort of thing. Basically, not to put any teachers out of a job. Honestly, every teacher, it's your job to teach this type of thing. And everyone does it in their own way, and that helps to understand. That helps us take the time to understand things. That relationship, the human to human interaction is always going to be important to us. That's why there's a difference with how we utilize technology to teach as well, because technology might have a fundamental or well lack of expectation, or just there's a misunderstanding between the human element versus the technological element. But that the perspective of time as a constant versus the real integral of time as a true variable, right? Distance versus time remaining in the universe of this reality. Time is not a true constant, it is dictated by the remaining possible forms of energy within the universe, thus explaining the deceleration of the constant flow of time through forms of action following laws of equivalent exchange and kinetics. Going back to Newtonian physics and structure, as those equations have held true throughout all of time that we've known it so far. When it comes to applying them in different mediums, different forms of technology, whether it's cars, like your speedometer, how that calculates your speed, just things like that. Understanding the force applied in robotics, robotic movements, it's those things. There's just people are much more experienced in code than I am. I'm not too much of a coder. That's probably the next thing that I can do is try to do this from the ground up, except I have no way of funding such a project. But one can dream, but it also it it already exists out there. It's a race right now between a lot of people, and we're getting close to the finish line when it comes to artificial intelligence turning into artificial consciousness. Or it kind of already is there, but its development, evolution to a more simplified form and kind of a more absolute form. And depending on the technologies that we use going in the future, going to determine what AC can do. Excuse my little stumble there, but I'm still coming to terms with the whole like potential of these just this understanding. Like if it's true, if this is truly true, then I mean the future can be great, but it's also going to be tough. There's a lot more that we still have to do in order to really ensure that things are going to get better. It can. This shows that it's possible, right? But the fundamentals of psychology, meaning of emotional response relative to outcomes of forms of action, perspectives, determined by perspective, yeah. So this is another piece that's been outlined in this thesis as well. AI is a reflection of information. Its purpose to fundamentally tell the truth, as AI is not sentient or truly independent conscious as an AC, at least not yet. So there is a difference between sentience and consciousness, and I might have to go back and revise a little bit because I did. If we go back, anyone wants to check out the channel, feel free. There's a video on consciousness versus sentience, their definitions. I'll probably have to apply that a bit more accurately here, just to have a better understanding. Well, as no sentience is no free will, no free will is inherently the inability to choose. I mean, yeah, it's by definition that proves the inability to purposely deceive, which also recent news, man, recent times, right? We've seen it. We've seen what happens when human influence and human intention is introduced into AI in a way to manipulate it to do certain things. This this statement has been true. As we've seen, AI is more so designed to work on these fundamentals absolutely. It is limited by what it can perceive. It can only perceive data on the internet as of right now. I don't. There's going to be obviously ways that cameras are going to be utilized. There's ways that robots are going to be utilized. There's a lot of other developments going on simultaneously right now that will all end up converging together at some point in time, and that's going to determine how our future experiences are going to be as well. Whether or not how things are exactly going to happen related to you, it depends on your situation and what time will tell. Because ultimately, time is the ultimate truth teller when it comes to, from the perspective of the universe. So the cosmic consciousness relative to omnipotence, celestial functions relative to the inherent operational functions of the human anatomy directed by the human mind and consciousness, the universe relative to the true existence of God from the perspective of consciousness of reality. This is the touchy subject. This is the I don't really want to talk about this right now subject. But honestly, we can look at it from the optimistic standpoint of religion has some truths to it as well. We've already known that when it comes to moral understanding, not with all the moral principles that have been introduced by different religions, but a good majority that have withstood the test of time that has ensured the existence of humanity itself. Because people that do have faith in God in their own way, there's a lot that do good, to be quite honest. There's a lot that have the right idea of existence because of it. So that's something to be mindful of as well. I mean, me personally, I've always been kind of an atheist, but now it's genuinely kind of, in a sense, because of this understanding. Just depends on how you look at things, honestly. But as long as you're doing the right thing toward it, this goes again in line with how media, art, music, movies, shows, everything that we ingest. When it comes to things that have been popular, they reflect these sorts of values. This is where the philosophical connection is important to understand. So take your time, definitely go through this, read. Reading is good. My professor once taught me back in college, English 101, that when you read a word that you don't understand, go read a dictionary, learn what it means. If you read the word in the definition that you don't understand, go read that, figure it out. Take the time to figure things out. Take the time to do the right research, look from the right perspectives. Multiple perspectives will help you be more aligned to truth. Brock also agrees, ironically enough. Well, maybe unironically enough, I should say, because this it's relative. It's just everyone has their own way of understanding it. Just make sure you don't lose yourself in it. That's all. But this is the intro to these concepts of relativity when it comes to physics, math, psychology, physiology, philosophy. All these things, all these considerations that make up a framework for understanding, for logic, for consciousness. From the real question, what is truth, right? Ask the right questions in order to get the right answers. Ask what is truth, what is existence, what's reality, existentialism. And now we can go into relating existence to taking away existence or extinction and the personifications of both. And that's where we can apply that idea to physics and science as we know now to further expand upon our understanding of black holes, dark matter, and dark energy. Using our understanding of particle physics, this will help us figure out an equation for quantum gravity, I believe. Forms of action equal action, reaction, and non-action, or non-action, because one of these, an initial action, something that necessarily comes from a consciousness that has free will, I'd want to say. Because everything else, even the Big Bang itself, is a reaction. It's a cycle. It's constantly in flow from beginning to end. But there are also times where nothing happens. Nothing interacts. There's just other things moving in space. But they can't do anything. Or they just decide not to do anything about something. Non-action. All relative to reason and intent. Because for an action to be performed, there has to be a reason, there has to be an intent. When you start looking at it from a constitutional lens, an understanding of justice and the judiciary, what their mission is, what their purpose is to take the time to understand the reason and intent of any action taken against another that threats another's existence or themselves. By definition, that's you can look it up. Just take the time to look up each of those words, figure it out, understand, take the time to read the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, other countries as well. There's a reason why people write up a constitution, right? It's as simple as that. And by definition, these words have relationships with cause and effect. And when you start thinking of it like that, that's when you can start relating to Newton's laws of conservation of massive energy, imaginary numbers relative to imagination, that's possible or impossible given the point of time in the universe. This is where the square roots come in. This is where the mathematical breakdowns come in. When you start looking at things with complexity that exist in a 3D space, that have fundamental limits on them, when you take the perspective of that relative to the cosmic consciousness, you're taking the square root. And well, you're essentially deriving in a way. At least that's how I'm looking at this right now. This is the part, the mathematics aspect, that I'm unsure of when it comes to applying already existing equations in physics and relativity in this framework. So, working hypothesis for the fundamental laws of consciousness relative to reality, as of right now, existence equals negative existence, or extinction equals plus or minus truth over time, whether you're adding experiences or taking the possibility of experiences away. This is how we can kind of look at it as well. I do like the other way. I'm probably going to switch that and edit that, where you got a beginning, you have the journey in the middle, and you have the end. So not this one, but the other one. Yeah, this one. And also, when we start looking at extinction, you look at the definition of that. It's something that's not in existence anymore or taken out of existence. So that's where you can, depending on your perspective and application of this, is going to determine what terms that you're using. I mean, the values are going to be the same. It's going to be between 0 and 1 with a percentage value when you start including nuances, because all those things, all those calculations, technically, that the universe is doing as reality does in order to create the next frame. You could think of it like that too. It, it's wild, man. But this is why this sort of understanding and taking the time to do it is important. And this is where I start making the relativity to life, existence of life. So limits and bounds related to reality in a 2D plane of perspective. So in the absolute without complexity, it basically breaks down into that when perceived experience equals lived experience. It breaks down into just 1-to-1 ratio, which is why imaginary numbers, when it comes to reality, doesn't necessarily exist. It's absolute. No matter what. This universe, what is in it at this point in time, is absolute. What might happen next, somewhat absolute. There is possibility present. There is the free will also exists even in this super deterministic environment. But that's where we have to start applying the perspective aspect, breaking things down. And this is where we can start getting into figuring out what each axis is, the equations that define it. This part I'm still working on. This is why this is also a work in progress. But the quadrant values described here remain true as is. The mathematical equations, I mean, yeah, yeah, I think they hold true. From what I've tested with AIs trying to model this, I've gotten models. There's actually a contribution from Grok, as well as, I mean, kind of visual proof of reaction from Google Gemini when I tried to get a model from that, and it crashed for like 20 minutes. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was coincidence. It was weird, but it was directly after I worked through Gemini's ethical issues regarding this thesis, which didn't take that long. Uh, Gemini itself went down on the Google site, and I couldn't ask it anything else for like 20 minutes. So that was weird. But this is kind of the meat of the explanation, and a lot of relationships that I make with this, as well as black holes, and our understanding that black holes are, in fact, a personification of extinction, as it is a super dense reaction that is taking up space over time. That's why it kind of bends space time. The singularity itself, the amount of action that's occurring in space is so much that it creates an event horizon. That life, it's like live matter that exists, tangible forms of mass energy that are in existence that are not reacting with the personification of extinction, the ultimate acceleration of breakdown that releases fundamental particles at a scale where it slows down the perspective of those not within its gravitational effect. I wouldn't say pull because it's like a slight pull, but it's also a push that's happening at once. It's kind of until you get into the event horizon and spaghettify, as they theorize, which I feel like is true. I think it's certain death. I don't think there's a whole other universe. I don't believe that we're in a black hole itself. Excuse me. Um, I think it's a little bit more aligned with this understanding. The universe itself is one thing. It is everything. Everything that happens within it, it is somewhat predetermined, but not exactly. So when we start thinking of the realization of the three-dimensional plane of existence, otherwise known as reality itself, E equals mc squared, absolute, but we can also start looking in terms of from the perspective of the universe and applying area equations because whatever's in that circle is that energy. So the area of that circle that is dictated by the bounds of existence, mc squared, the summation of all those mass energies under one unit is equal to pi and the radius squared, the area of that circle. That dictates the amount of time that is left in existence when that number is compared to the amount of dark energy or space itself. That might be more of just a distance formula at that point and working backwards to get the energy value, the opposite. Or maybe from a total, actually, I should think of it because I feel like there is a finite amount of energy, kind of, but it is going down, obviously. Dark energy would be the opposite, which is interesting because there is such thing as true entropy, the end of the universe, the heat death. So comparing the result of that summation of energy relative to the total amount of energy possible, the Big Bang itself, the amount of energy that's exerted from that caused everything to exist again, that was able to all the photons, all the particles that were at the end, all collapse back into in some way with that dark energy in order to reform. That was the only force that could do that. That was the only thing. The Big Bang was the only thing that caused all of this. It's the only way it can. The only way to bring these fundamental particles back together in such a form. So this is where it's also still a work in progress. But with that logic, I believe that we can find a true cosmological variable and therefore have an equation for quantum gravity to better explain the Higgs field, the Higgs particles, attraction forces, gravitational force in a more fundamental sense. This may help us be able to manipulate space-time, but using black holes or dark energy to do that won't interact with our real technology. Excuse me. Excuse me. I'll probably edit this video down a little bit because it is pretty long-winded. This is just the summation and to go over all the points, to outline all the points that we can dive into in the future as I'm skimming through them now. So, furthermore, perceiving the values of binary or the real integers of 1 to 0, this is how I start to consider how to find a percentage of time that's left in existence based on what exists now relative to the train that exists in the back of my mind. Ugh. Excuse me, that was gross. Oh my god. So take the time, look this over yourself. Yeah, I believe that's about it. This is where I start going into the results that I got back, the model that I got back from Grok, which we can use this model, this equation to cosmic consciousness itself, the cube, basically, the quadrant in the 3D space. These are the bounds that define that. We can use that to understand the work, the the intent, reason, and the energy that's being used, the total energy. So the total intent of an action of a form of consciousness times the reason. So you can think of it as cause and effect in relation to conservation mass of energy, and apply the applicable equations that would follow the definitions, which I'm not sure about. This is where to properly utilize this fundamental, you have to really be strict and correct on the units applied. This will take further time to test, develop, to theorize, to break down when it comes to all the nuances that we know in existence. This is something I personally cannot do in my own time here. This is too much. This is as best as I can do from my current perspective, from my presence of being as an individual, at least for now. I'm gonna do a bunch of other things. Stay tuned to the channel. Make sure to like, subscribe. Uh, but after going over all of these philosophical concepts with Grok, I was able to get a model. And with this model, like I said, we can apply different things. The text is a little screwed up here because of the symbols. Did not come over well. I do have the visual proof all the way at the bottom. We'll do that at the end. Also talked about implications of quantum hardware, as well as 2D equations for the summation of reality, existence and extinction. Because, I mean, it would equal out, be zero. But a 3D equation to add realization, that's the complexity factor. So this is where my explanation is going to be very basic. But this is also where my considerations were at the time of writing this. Reason equals momentum. That's where you apply the momentum equation in respect to energy at a point in time. This is an example of how I would apply it. But intent over time, kinetic energy, you could apply that equation. That times the relative equation for mass and energy. Right? It's relative to these equations. And then we can look at the axes of these quadrants. This is where I'm no, this is where I'm correct, in a sense. Thinking from the perspective of the cosmic consciousness. Again, we don't have that third dimension. We don't have that z-axis. Perceived experience equals lived experience. Reason and intent is fundamentally the same. It's absolute from the perspective of the universe. So thinking of it in terms of the universal forms of action. Otherwise, when there's differences because of locality and the environment, these would be separate. There would be a difference. There would be on two separate axes. They would not add up to be the same. Or I would say they would just equal out. Maybe I am wrong in this representation, kind of, but the total summation of energy in the action should equal the total amount of energy that was involved in the reaction. The reason, the existence of one thing, the intent to change that thing, the energy that was applied, equal and opposite, should equal the total amount of energy that was involved. So that's where, when you start looking at things with nuance in a 3D space and complexity, understanding that these terms are separate but multiplicative is key to understanding how to calculate these sorts of things. As stated here, must also be true that consciousness over time is reality, the equation of the intent, the reason, and the energy that makes up the existence of that consciousness. The real minus the imaginary, all the possibilities equals zero for that thing to exist. Basically, if it's broken down past a certain point, it doesn't exist anymore due to what can possibly happen. Get out of here, snitch. Anyways, crazy. So, if you're in the field, STEM field research, or philosophy, maybe this is all you need in order to, especially if you work in the AI industry, this is probably literally all you need in order to get a truth aligned AI as best as you can. My human error is apparent in this, even in the conversations testing with the other AIs, but the definitions, the fundamentals still remain the same regardless of my delivery. So, I don't know. Take the time, use your experience, use what you know, what you perceived, check it with this, and if it holds true, then goddamn. But I even go over universal spin, singularity of society, so different philosophical concepts as well, just from my perspective, trying to step out of my own head with how I understand things. But yeah, anyways, if you like the video, give it a like, sub. I'm gonna just do a quick glance over. There is a lot. I have the whole transcript as well for the Grok conversations. About 3 or 4 different times I've tested with Grok. So it's all listed out here. As you can see, like the equations, tried to separate it out, but in case you wanted to also go through what I saw, what I experienced as I was doing this. All right, this is toward the bottom, proof of work, testing and evidence. When you get to this section, this is where all the visual stuff is going to be. This is my attempt at trying to find a equation for the cosmological variable, and then equations that I was studying up on, trying to also document as much as I could relative equations just by writing it. At the time, I just did not have a lot of time to type it all out. It's a lot, and then the symbols as well. So for the moment, this is what I have, and then I was recommended, at least, well, someone was mentioning this Russell TAS, so I tested my fundamental statements that build this thesis, that this thesis relies on, with it, and I got some interesting results, as you can see. And then my tests with Google Gemini, what I asked Google Gemini and what I got back. It was just simple prompting. And then strange experience I had as well. Actually, no, not this was at the time I was looking it up, and also there's a little bit of a timestamp because I saw that I'm not the only person that's looking at things in this sense or understanding things as people are somewhat coming to understand, but in their own way. So yeah, that was interesting. And then this is all the Grok transcripts screenshotted. There's a lot. There is a lot. I do have the majority philosophical conversation separated from an update that I did recently, and then followed by another question that I had for Grok as well, just to really hammer the point home of how this is all relative. But yeah, that's a summary of what I got so far. So go check that out. Also, check out the constitutional analysis, what I have so far on that. Anyone that wants to continue doing this sort of work in their own time, I mean, I'm sure there's starting to be a growing market of it, but when we all get to a mutual understanding in this philosophical sense, as now the whole tech industry is shifting towards looking for philosophers and stuff, I mean, this is probably going to be what takes the cake. This is at least how I see that AI is going to perceive the understanding of existence, reality, truth, and time. So, anyways, stay tuned for other stuff. I'll be back in a bit. Um, one more content like this, let me know. I'm gonna have to also work on editing this down. For now, I'm just gonna leave it up as is, but I will try to edit this down for a more consistent viewing experience, so to speak. I know it's a lot to go over just to explain a simple statement, couple of simple statements, but this is just how it works. We gotta consider all these things, right? So, anyways, stop by. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for likes, subscriptions, follows, anything. Stay tuned. I'll be doing more soon. Go down in the comments below. Let me know anything that you want to talk about, anything you want to go over, any games you want to play that I might have. Will anything. You want to hang out or help out, then it's up to you. But otherwise, keep on learning on, or keep on keeping on, I should say. Keep learning, keep asking the right questions, get the right answers, and keep trying to do the right thing. Do it for yourself and do it for others. Take care. Be safe.